All right, good morning, everyone. 11 o'clock, Friday morning, uh, April 3rd, I believe it is. It's easy to lose track of time and day in the midst of everything that's going on. Glad you were able to take 45 minutes to an hour of your time today to talk a little bit about the fantasy world of sports and gambling. My name is Dan Trolaro. I'm the Assistant Executive Director for 800 Gambler here in New Jersey. And as participants kind of come on the line and on the Zoom, I will do my best to keep everyone muted. We know sometimes background noise can be a little bit distracting, but it's okay. Rather have you here than not here. And so if there's a question, if there's a comment, feel free to use the functionality of Zoom. I've only been using Zoom for maybe about a month. So getting up to speed rather quickly, but perhaps not as quick as I could be in terms of looking at chat requests or messages. So I'll do my best to answer any questions as they come up. We will allow some time towards the end for question and answer, for comment, for thoughts. I will also give you my cell number so that if you're not comfortable using the technology on the Zoom, or if you're dialing in from your phone, certainly feel free to shoot me a text. And also if you have questions going forward after today's 1 hour webinar, my cell number is 201-316-6160. Again, that's 201-316-6160, and I'll keep that close to me. If I don't respond to you right away, it's because I want to get through a particular section, and then we'll have some time. So this is definitely an interesting time in terms of gambling. We had sports gambling running full steam ahead, and we're going to be talking about some offshoots of sports gambling today, even some activities that aren't necessarily considered gambling from a regulatory or legislative perspective. So we really just want to kind of dive into some emerging trends, the world of sports gambling, and the world of fantasy sports, because there's a bit of a convergence going on right now in three different areas. You have the world of fantasy sports, you have the world of video gaming with esports, which I'll describe and talk about in a little bit, and then the world of traditional sports gambling, but also emerging trends within sports gambling. So these three sectors are converging because the American public is hungry for something to do during this pandemic that's surrounding sports. There is no traditional mainstream sports. The four major leagues, the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, the NFL, are all on postponement right now. And even soccer, other areas where people might kind of consider secondary type sporting events, are canceled as well. So there are new emerging forms of sports that are kind of coming out. Ping pong has been catching a lot of attention. Australian soccer, Russian soccer. So some areas of the world are still having sporting contests, and the gambling community is paying attention. Drone racing is another one. And then we'll even talk about some of the electronic sports with simulations that are going on. So it's a fascinating time. So as we go through today, we want to cover first level set with each other, the type of gambler that we're really talking about here. And there are many different types of gamblers, and I'll explain why that's important. We're going to look through fantasy sports contests, esports, sports betting, elements of responsible gambling, which are essentially very crucial during a time like this, keeping it responsible, a form of entertainment and fun. And then we'll have closing time for questions and answers. Anyone that has seen me present knows that I am an in-person presenter. I do love to shake hands and see people, and that's just not possible in these times. So with a webinar, one of the unique challenges is that we can't necessarily have as easy of a dialogue. So I will be doing obviously a lot of talking during this particular webinar, and we'll leave time at the end. For any of you that just joined, my cell number, if you want to ask questions and you're not comfortable using the technology, my cell is 201-316-6160. So first, let's take a look at gambling and dopamine. And I like to show this slide because for people who are maybe not familiar with gambling as an addiction or the severity, gambling and dopamine are closely connected because it's not about the money. It's about the action. People with a gambling problem typically will gamble for one of two reasons, either to gain action or to escape a problem that they don't know how to deal with or they don't want to deal with. Or perhaps they were never given the right tools to deal with a problem. So there could be many reasons to escape. But when you look at this, how the brain reacts, dopamine is not released when expecting a loss. It doesn't feel good to expect a loss. But when you're anticipating a win, that possibility of something positive, something that can remove you from a negative state, maybe a negative mood state, then the potential gains light up various areas of the brain. This was from 2007, the Society for Neuroscience. There's a similar chart or graphic that shows brain activation and how the brain activates in a problem or disordered gambler very similarly to someone who's using cocaine. Similar regions and similar areas of the brain light up. So the point of this is that you don't have to consume a substance in order to become addicted to a particular activity or where the habit becomes the daily solution to dealing with some other area of your life. So gambling in the DSM-5 in 2013 became the first non-substance related addictive disorder. And that was big for the world of the gambling community and for those therapists and clinicians who can help and treat the problem gambler. Because it's no longer just about impulse control. It's no longer a moral failure or a weakness. There's actually something going on at a deeper level, and now there's a diagnostic code. So this was very important, and this was a big breakthrough for treating the problem gambler. Now, we do have different types of gamblers. I want to be very clear throughout this presentation that 800 Gambler is neither for nor against gambling. We simply want to assist and provide support and treatment for both the problem gambler as well as the family member or loved ones. And so we recognize that more than 90% of the American public, give or take, depending on the statistics that you're seeing, we'll just say 90%, 9 out of every 10, are social gamblers. They gamble occasionally for fun. They stick to limits. It doesn't create problems within their life or in the lives of those around them. They're considered social gamblers. As you go through types of gamblers, you have a serious gambler, someone who will still gamble regularly. They do it as a hobby, yet they still stick to their limits. And it's a form of entertainment that they really want to make sure they get to enjoy maybe on a daily or semi-weekly or weekly basis. Professional gamblers, kind of the next type of gambler, where now they're looking to earn a living in this profession. They will list this as an item on their resume. You'll see, for 5 years, I was a professional poker player, whatever the resume might indicate. It's an interesting profession, and also interesting how long a person can stay kind of in that professional gambler role without crossing lines or limits. There's some research about length of time a person maintains professional gambler and the concerns about crossing into that next area of problem gambling. Problem gambling is where you start to experience problems in various areas of your life. And this individual may start meeting some criteria within the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual within the community. Maybe they have a few of the criteria that are being met. Perhaps they're lying to others. Perhaps they're preoccupied. Perhaps they're gambling longer than they intended to. But it's not creating major disruptions. Major disruptions start to occur when you get into the diagnosis of a disordered gambler. Per the diagnostic manual, DSM-5, you start to meet at least 4 of the 9 criteria. And I won't go through the all 9 criteria today. You can find that online. You can find that on our website. But you're starting to meet at least 4. If you have 4 or 5, you're mild. 6 or 7 is moderate. 8 or 9 is severe. So there's a continuum to identify a disordered gambler. And then the antisocial gambler is one that warrants consideration. Gambling as a way to manipulate others, they often have a blatant disregard for the rules. They also may be known as or called personality gamblers. And one of the areas of concern in this particular type of gambler are the illegal facets. You typically will see higher illegal activity among the antisocial or personality gambler. So as many of you know, one of my favorite slides is the slide of this little girl with the eye hiding behind this fan, because gambling is often called the hidden addiction. It's extremely difficult to diagnose, especially if we're not asking the right questions, if we're not asking any questions. The gambler oftentimes will not present if they're walking through your door, or if they're walking into a classroom, or if they're walking into your office, because there's no telltale signs. You're not going to see bloodshot eyes. There's no slurring of speech. no smell on the breath, there's no track marks on the arm. If you give a gambler a urine sample, they're not going to pee dice. Nothing's coming out. So it's extremely difficult to diagnose, extremely easy to hide. And what's interesting about the nature of a gambling addiction, it's hard to overcome for the problem gambler. Because in the gambler's mindset, they are one win away from making everything okay, or from alleviating some of that pain, maybe not relieving it totally, but just kind of easing up the pressure that they're feeling, because they just think that they always have another chance to win. That is ingrained in a gambler, because the nature of gambling is one where every so often a gambler does win something. That's the intermittent reward schedule. And intermittent rewards are so difficult to give up, because the gambler will think that they will win on the next throw of the dice, on the next sport bet that they place, on the next turn of the card, because historically they have won in those past elements. The problem is that the gambler never knows one of three things: how often that will occur, how much it will be for, and when the next time it will be. So there's three elements that are out of the gambler's control, but the gambler still has that hope that the next sequence of events will turn positively. And that's what makes gambling so difficult to give up as well. So what are some reasons for disordered gambling? Escaping day-to-day problems, seeking action. There might be other deeper rooted issues, psychological or cognitive problems. We start talking about depression and anxiety. It's interesting because on a case-by-case basis, we don't know if the gambling leads to these problems or if these problems have led to someone to start gambling. It's the chicken and the egg. Sometimes they simultaneously occur. So it's a case-by-case basis, and that's why every individual needs to be treated uniquely, and these factors need to be considered. Two areas have been cited as potential issues for developing a gambling problem, and one of them is experiencing a big win early. Similar to saying not seeing the negatives at an early age. So if I was someone who gambled at an early age and I won a lot of money, or it made me feel good to bond with my mother or father over gambling, and I had positive recollection of that, that could be considered a big win, because that was a time perhaps when it was meaningful in my life to have that emotional or social connection with a family member. I might see gambling in a very positive light. I might not see the negatives. So age of onset is one, and experiencing a big win, whatever big win means, doesn't always have to be financial gain. And remember that it can be an emotional gain, a social gain. Big win can come in many different forms. And then we also know the risk factors, whether it's substance use disorder or gambling disorder or problem gambling. We have to look at trauma, adverse childhood experiences, which weigh both the negative and the positive experiences within a child's life at an early age. We have to take a look at personality traits. Oftentimes we'll hear folks indicate that someone might have an addictive personality. We know, generally speaking, there's no addictive personality. However, a person can have personality traits that lend themselves to developing, being one area that helps to develop addiction. Addiction is biopsychosocial, many factors, many facets, but having a risk-taking personality trait, that can kind of lead and be a contributing factor towards someone developing an addiction, along with many other areas. So let's take a look. Before I move forward here, I want to just check on the chat. I saw a chat come through, so give me a moment. Yes, Camille, thank you for that question. I will be providing the PowerPoint to anyone who asks for it. You can email me separately at the conclusion of today's webinar. My email is the one that this request came from. You can use dan.trollero@800gambler.org. I believe many of you do have my email address. So happy to send that PowerPoint along. Thanks, Camille. Let's take a look at fantasy sports. As we go through fantasy sports, it's interesting. In the state of New Jersey, fantasy sports contests was deemed not to be gambling. It is not a form of gambling per the law. However, if you look at the mechanics behind fantasy sports contests, in general, the goal of a fantasy sports contest is to risk something of value to win something of value. Look at some of the images on your screen. You have the players like DraftKings, FanDuel. You see $12 million in cash prizes in the lower right on a fantasy football contest. In the center, you see League of Legends. You might say, what the heck is League of Legends? That's an esports. That's competitive video gaming, where you can play fantasy sports contests with video gaming, and Rotoballer is one of the sponsors of that. So there's a lot of money and a lot of action to be had in the world of fantasy sports. But what are fantasy sports? When I say fantasy sports contests, what am I saying? Well, fantasy sports contests are also known as rotisserie contests. And the purpose and goal of a fantasy sports league is you have a bunch of individuals who come together and they assemble imaginary teams using real players. So the most popular form of fantasy is football. Every year, millions of people come together and they'll draft players onto their imaginary team in hopes of assembling a team that scores lots of points week in and week out, so that this individual can win a prize at the end of the season. That's known as season-long fantasy sports contests. Back in the early 90s, even the early 2000s, this was typically done with pencil and paper or with notebooks, but now it's done online. There's tens, dozens, hundreds of services out there that you can upload your rosters, and the scoring will be tracked online and automatically for you. Now, when you draft your team of real players, those players earn points based upon how they perform on the field. Let's take a look. Here's an example of a fantasy football sports scoring example from FanDuel. You can see here in a football game, someone scores a touchdown, that's worth 6 points. If there's a field goal, that's worth 3 points. But if it's a field goal of more than 50 yards, you get an extra point for that also. And then you can see if there's a fumble, you lose 3 points. So you can see there's a complex scoring system. And then based upon how those players perform, they will tally points. At the end of the game, based upon the statistical performance, the player now has points assigned. Now, you add up all the points on your team, and maybe you score 120 points at the end of the game. Well, perhaps I'm playing against a friend of mine, and he scored 130 points. He won. So that's over. His record's 1-0. I'm 0-1. I've lost a game. He's won a game, and we move on to the next week. That's traditional scoring. But fantasy sports transitioned a number of years ago into something a little more frequent, and that was called daily fantasy sports. So using the same logic, using the same scoring method, using the same principles, instead of having a season that lasts multiple weeks or a team that you have for months in a football season, you now redraft a new team every week. Or for sports that are played daily, you redraft a new team daily. This is an accelerated version of season-long fantasy sports. So it takes place over shorter periods of time. So you're now drafting players, into a team on a daily or weekly basis. Why does that matter? You know, it's interesting when you start looking at that dopamine rush, anticipating a reward that we saw in the first screen. Instead of me having to wait potentially weeks or months for the season to be done or for the outcome to be determined, I now get a chance to know if I won something on a daily basis or a weekly basis. I'm shortening the reward schedule. And so the activity and the reward is being reinforced more frequently. And that feels good. But that also leads to more preoccupation for some in terms of studying and researching the players that should be a part of their team. There's also now, as it is expanded online, there's more games to choose from. There's more contests to choose from. Entry fees ranging from free entries up to thousands of dollars to enter some of these tournaments. So season-long fantasy has progressed so much that it is now a daily concept, and FanDuel and DraftKings are the two most frequently known because they did a ton of advertising a few years ago. And those are the ones that captured the lion's share of the market. This is a booming business. It even has weather people that are dedicated. There's merchandise. When I talk about the weather people, if you think about a fantasy sports contest, like a baseball game, if I'm going to draft a baseball player, I am not going to want to pick a player on a team who is playing in, say, Yankee Stadium when it's a very windy day maybe the winds are gusting in at 50 miles an hour from the outfield. And I need to know that with my fantasy weather person, and they do have fantasy weather people now, and they will tell you where the weather looks bad for fantasy players. Do not pick a player on this team playing at this stadium because weather could become a factor. That's the level of detail that this has grown into, and it's a huge phenomenon. So what's the relationship between fantasy sports and gambling? I mentioned in New Jersey, fantasy sports contests are not legally considered gambling. However, you still normalize the spending of money on sports-based outcomes. And when I say an outcome, yes, the final score of the game does not determine if your fantasy team wins or loses, but rather the player's performance is what determines the points that your team scores. But there's still an outcome. There's still a sport-based outcome. And daily fantasy sports, as I just mentioned, it reinforces that outcome and it rewards the participant faster than traditional season-long fantasy. So now you have that constant reward schedule or that intermittent reward schedule that has been accelerated to daily, sometimes hourly, which I'll show you in a little bit. Daily fantasy sports also reinforces the near miss. One of the elements that the websites use is it'll show you how close you are to actually winning some money. And they'll use a visual representation of that. And forgive me, I did not upload a visual representation, but I'll certainly do that for the next one. And it'll show you how close you are. And you could be within points of being eligible to win some real money. And when you use a visual representation, it definitely sinks in. Cognitively, as I'm looking at that, it's making my brain think I'm so close. It's that element of a near miss, same element of a near miss that the casinos have with the slot machine. When you see jackpot, jackpot, and then you're slightly off by one on that third wheel, your brain thinks you were so close. The near miss makes you want to do that activity again. Fantasy sports sites use the same logic, the same psychology to keep people engaged and to keep them with that gambling hook. That near miss is such a hook in gambling psychology, it makes an individual want to do it again. So Rutgers did a study, and it was in the Journal of Gambling Behavior in June of 2018. And what they studied was the nature, frequency, and preference of gambling behaviors, as well as problem gambling severity and comorbid conditions for daily fantasy players. So what they did is they found a little more than 3,600 New Jersey residents age 18 plus, because that's the age to legally play fantasy sports in New Jersey. Now, what they found, most predictive factors of DFS players, they tended to see that those who played daily fantasy sports also participated in a higher number of gambling activities. So there's a connection right there. There's familiarity, that normalcy of spending money to make money, risking something of value to win something of value carries over into the legal and regulated gambling activities. They also noticed that daily fantasy players played at an increased frequency. So they just didn't play once a week. They would play on a daily or multiple time per week schedule. They tended to be male. They tended to show higher reports of suicidal ideations. And that also falls in line with the nature of the disordered gambler. Various reports around suicidality, rate, and ideation. Nancy Petrie, wonderful researcher back in early 2000s, perhaps 2002, indicated that roughly this attempted suicide rate for a disordered gambler was roughly 17%, but ideations can be somewhere between 40 to 50%. And then lastly, most predictive of daily fantasy players was that they tended to be single, and also Hispanic was noted as an elevated predictor. And I thought that was pretty interesting. That was one area that I personally wanted to follow up a little bit more as to the nature of fantasy sports and why that's drawing perhaps a certain culture or a certain ethnicity. And that's an area that, as a council, that we intend to follow up down the line. So we've talked about fantasy sports contests, and now I want to kind of transition and pivot into esports. And this is important, especially during the COVID-19 virus that we're seeing. Esports, for those of you who are not aware, quite simply, is competitive video gaming in real time, often for money. So it's competitive video gaming in real time for money. On this screen, you see a few images. You see images of the Staples Center, back when people used to go to arenas, 20,000 people packing an arena to cheer for their favorite video game team during a League of Legends tournament. And here in the top right, you can see a team of what looks to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, perhaps 6 players sitting in chairs. They're working together, navigating a board or a screen to try to have their esports, their video gaming team, catapult to the first spot, win the tournament. It's a team-based activity. Esports, these are professional gaming events, and they're gaining speed. Among gamers, people who play video games as a hobby, 40% will watch and live stream at least once per week. Those numbers are way higher now since the orders to stay home have been in place. I believe I saw a statistic recently. The average number of live viewers on one of the platforms was roughly 9 million people a week. That's up to about 22 to 23 million people per week right now, because kids are home. They're learning virtually. Parents are home. There's a lot more free time for people to consume digital product. 25% of gamers who watch esports also tune in for more than 4 hours per week. Those numbers right now are higher. What's interesting is that those who enjoy esports and competition, live competition, 2/3 of them also enjoy reality TV or competition shows. So there's a natural consistency in terms of the shows that they like to consume. That's why you'll see certain advertisements occur during various TV shows. They know the demographic, they know the transition from one to another, so they'll advertise product across brands. So what's the future of esports? Well, the Olympic Committee, the Olympics are already postponed for this year going into next summer, but the Olympics are looking to add esports as a medal event. So professional video gaming as a medal event. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, but it's an observation how the times shift and how the times change. Esports, it's a global industry. It's an audience of over 300 million people, revenue of nearly $1 billion a year and accelerating. As I mentioned before, it's competitive gaming in real time. And what's interesting about esports, and I want to take a moment to just kind of just talk this through. Your traditional teenager or adolescent who plays on the Xbox or the PlayStation or their console at home, they may not be interested in esports. They're not interested in partnering up perhaps with some of their friends to compete, to win a tournament. Most kids just like to go home, spend 4, 8, 12, 24 hours on their Xbox and play through games individually. Yes, they talk with their friends. Yes, they'll partner up with some of their friends, but it's not a competitive format. And they just like to just play, just have a lot of time to play. Video gaming for most kids is seen as a way to escape. It's seen as a way to take pressure off, relieve the school day, as a form of camaraderie, social interaction. So they see the use of video games in those terms. Esports is different though. For those schools that are starting to add esports programs, they are doing so to allow kids an outlet, to perhaps give an extracurricular or after school activity to someone who may not be athletically gifted or inclined, or would not perhaps make a sports team, or maybe is not familiar or comfortable with band or any other extracurricular activity. It gives them just another outlet to stay connected with each other. It does provide relief, but it also provides teamwork, and it's collaboration. Over 100 million Americans do play video games, and Twitch live streams these tournaments. Twitch is one of the major live streaming platforms of video game tournaments. Amazon bought it in 2014 for $1 billion. Amazon's already making money and is now profitable on that purchase. But when you look at the 9.7 million people watch daily, just last week, that's over 20 million people now watching, more than double, because of the fact that we have stay-at-home orders. We have COVID-19. And so now more people are consuming this space. Esports, as we continue through, colleges and universities are offering scholarships. So if we think about this, if the Olympics are going to add esports as a medal event, then we know for any athletic competition that is Olympic level, those participants have started training since they were tiny, since they were little. In some instances, you hear 2, 3, 4 years old in some for gymnastics in some countries. So now when someone is starting to practice because they might have Olympic dreams, or perhaps they want to go to Stanford University on a scholarship to play competitive video gaming, they have to start at an earlier age. So we're starting to see high schools offer competitive esports teams, and those teams are in a league. And these leagues have seasons. So you might see during the winter months, you have high school basketball, you have high school esports tournaments, you have high school esports leagues. So now it's a season-long event, maybe 3-4 months. They play a certain number of games, they qualify for championships, there's medals, and then these kids are hoping to get scholarships to go to college. Colleges are also offering degrees in management, esports management, how to run a league, how to draw in marketing partners, how to just generate a buzz, attract players, and carry this thing to the next level. So this is not just a small little fly-by-night operation. This is major money. We're talking billions of dollars industry. It's a cultural phenomenon. And even most recently at the Asian Games in the Philippines in November, esports was a medal event at the Southeast Asian Games. So it's something that has a cult following. And the reason I mention this as we look through, because now during the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen an interesting rise of esports from a different perspective. I mentioned fantasy sports before, not legally considered gambling. However, you're still risking something of value to win something of value. So let's take a quick look back through the month of March. March 11th, I remember watching TV that night. I'm at home and I'm watching ESPN, and the NBA quickly announced they're suspending the rest of their season until further notice after Rudy Gobert from the Utah Jazz had tested positive for the coronavirus. Earlier that day, he was actually making a joke of the virus by coughing on the microphones of all the reporters during a press conference. Turns out he tested positive. So the NBA stopped the games that night. From there, day after day, we started to see other professional and semi-pro and amateur leagues postpone games one by one, postponing seasons because this was a real concern. And then recently, the International Olympic Committee announced that the Olympic Games would be pushed back to 2021. And we continue to see fallout, and we will continue to see more fallout depending on how much we can flatten the curve, how long this pandemic lasts, concern over a second wave. There's a lot of factors. So we're living in the midst of the times now. So that's what the traditional sports world looked like, and that's what has kind of happened to sports. It's on pause. But with no sports to consume, the American public is hungry and bored. We sit home. We can only clean our homes or our apartments so often, can only participate in so many Zoom webinars, play with your children, read books, you exercise, you do whatever you do to get you through these times. But we're also an American people who just crave sports and crave competition. So the video gaming industry is seizing this opportunity. And some things that have really started popping up are competitive video games that are being simulated, that you can actually watch on YouTube. You can watch on various websites. For instance, NBA 2K is a massively popular video game. They're now simulating games for people to watch. They've partnered with FanDuel so that you can now actually draft players and make a fantasy team from simulated video games, and you can try to win real prizes. You're not risking any money. And I want to be very clear, this is not considered a form of gambling technically. However, you're still able to consume a sport product, draft a player, hope for a good outcome, and win a prize. The mechanics and the behaviors look super similar. Formula One racing and NASCAR, they have a virtual racing Grand Prix series where you can pick players and then score points. So they're taking now they're taking video game simulations and making fantasy sports contests out of these. And these graphics are very appealing. As a matter of fact, last night, there was a website that was replaying a game between the Baltimore Ravens and the Pittsburgh Steelers, an NFL game. And it was on one of the most popular video game titles in the world, on Madden 20, I believe it was. And they replayed the game. It's a simulation, and people could pick fantasy players. They could make a team. They could try to win prizes. Again, they also partnered with FanDuel. So the FanDuels and DraftKings of the world are really trying to provide offerings to people in the gaming space, and you're starting to see the merge of esports and also the merge of video game simulations into the world of fantasy sports. This is something, if you look back 2-3 months ago, never would have thought of it. And the graphics look great. Sometimes it's like watching an actual event on TV with some of these graphics. So we're seeing more action. We're seeing more competitive video game tournaments because these tournaments can be done remotely. They can be watched virtually. And then in some cases, they can be wagered on digitally. Now, League of Legends, which is an esports competitive video gaming league, some of the websites are taking bets on that. They're taking bets on drone racing. They're taking bets on ping pong that I mentioned earlier, Australian soccer, Russian soccer, horse racing that's still going on in the very few places. So there are still things to be wagered on. That being said, what we're primarily seeing are people shifting back into the poker rooms and back onto the virtual casinos and playing things like slot machines, blackjack, those types of table games and slot machine games in those states where it's legal. And New Jersey is one of those states that has had legalized internet gambling since 2013. So what is the impact? I always think about the youth through this. These are very interesting times. And it'll be interesting to see what the youth remember maybe 10 years from now or 5 years from now. Who's impacted, who's not impacted, who remembers the positives, but then who perhaps was scared and there's some element of trauma and remembers the negatives. But when we look at the impact of gaming on today's youth, gaming does provide a couple of benefits. Number one, if it's something that's free, that's great. It provides temporary escape. It provides social connection. Remember, it's not right. We don't have to be socially isolated. We just have to be physically isolated, right? 6 feet is physical separation, not social separation. We're social right now. We're coming together for a common cause to learn, expand, increase our knowledge, and we're doing that in a different form or a different social context, but we're still together. We're sharing something that hopefully we take away and can apply either personally or professionally. So we still have social connection. But gaming also provides measurable growth. Gaming for some kids provides purpose and meaning. It can also provide a dopamine overload. And one of the concerns that we see with this present virus is that when you get so used to gaming so much on a regular basis, we're kind of now increasing that level. That tolerance is increasing over time. What does it mean when the world starts to shift out of this current pandemic and kind of comes back? Where is the new normal? Where is that new plateau that we hit? What does it look like? We don't know. We don't know what things will look like because we don't know how long it will last. But we just know a couple of things is that we have to make sure that we're always continuing to have conversation with our youth. We have to make sure that we're talking to them about their concerns or their fears, asking them questions such as, tell me something that made you laugh today. Tell me something that maybe got you a little nervous today. Having that dialogue, not just with the kids, but with our family members, with our staff, with our coworkers, with our colleagues. The other impact of gaming and even esports and fantasy sports, esports is a safe place to play and experiment. It's a safe place to fail. Kids love playing games for that reason. They love having nothing at stake or very little at stake. And if they fail, it's okay. Because sometimes all of us have a lot of pressure on ourselves to succeed and to have the right answer and to hold it together, especially in times of crisis. So it makes perfect sense to me that we all want to have that safe place to play or experiment or fail. Risks with gaming. And with these types of games that we're seeing, with the esports, with the esports simulations, with the competitive video gaming, these elements can lead to problem gambling. It's a bigger concern among youth because of the way the brain develops. If you look at the fourth point down, the brain develops the gas pedal faster than the braking system. If you take nothing else away, take that point away today. Because when the brain develops back to front and that decision-making piece is last to be developed somewhere in the mid-20s, it all depends on male, female, it depends on prior substance use, but just think roughly mid-20s, the gas pedal always gets developed faster than the braking system. That's why kids want to go, go, go. And as adults and parents and caregivers, we say, whoa, 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 slow down. Let's think that through. And so what we also have to realize is that the earlier one starts an activity, the higher likelihood to develop a problem, especially, as I mentioned earlier, if they don't see the negative consequences or the negative aspects of that activity. So as we move through the last 10 minutes before we get to Q&A, let's get into sports betting because New Jersey, excuse me one moment here, legalized sports betting in June of 2018. It's a monumental day. Prior to that, sports gambling was largely done through the sports books in Nevada, elements in Delaware. Obviously, some aspects of sports betting were available in Delaware at the time. But mostly, if you were gambling on sports in New Jersey, you were doing it illegally. You were doing it through perhaps an individual that you might know in your town or your neighborhood. You're doing it on an illegal sports book, those sites like Bovada or Bookmaker or BetUS, sites that are offshore with no responsible gambling protocols in place, blatant disregard for deposit limits. And also then, if you did win money, you would hope that they would actually pay you in a timely fashion. But sports betting, that all changed in June of 2018. Governor Murphy picked up where former Governor Christie had left off and carried through and enacted sports betting. And each state also has now since been moving forward, passing legislation which allows for sports betting on a state-by-state basis. Basically, the repeal of the federal law gave states the right to decide whether or not they wanted to allow sports betting in each state. So before we get into sports betting, I want to show you a chart that we circulate internally and we've shared with a number of individuals. And this is our helpline. At 800 Gambler, we own and operate the 800 Gambler helpline. And our mission is simple. We want to provide that support and we want to provide treatment services for those who are struggling with a gambling problem or for the family member or loved one who knows of someone. Because oftentimes the family member is forgotten about when we talk about addiction. So we have a grant where we're able to leverage resources and funding to carry a network of treatment providers to help treat the problem gambler or the family member. So each month we took a look at the handle, which is the amount of money that has been wagered on sports in the state of New Jersey since inception. So you will see on the left side, July of 2018 was the first full month of sports gambling. Carry that forward through February 29th. It was a leap year, so we had the extra day in February 29th. And each month you see handle. Handle is the total pure number of dollars that are being wagered on sports each month in New Jersey. What you quickly identify is that that's an upward sloping trend to the right. It is cyclical. And the reason it's cyclical is because when the major sports are in season tend to be October, November, December, right? Those are the times when you have the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball ends in early November when the World Series is done, but then you have the football season, you have hockey, and you have basketball. So you can see the cycles. What we compared that to, we took the amount of money that's wagered each month, and then we also took the percentage of helpline calls where the person who calls in is indicating that sports gambling is the primary issue. And when you layer the two against each other, you can see, generally speaking, as handle has increased over time, so has the percentage of calls where sports gambling is the primary issue. Prior to the legalization of sports gambling in the state of New Jersey, the percentage of sports helpline calls ranged anywhere from 2 to 5%. After 2018, that number, as you can see, has gone up as high in some cases as 19% in February of 19. We also see 16%, 17% more recently. The average right now hovers somewhere between 12 and 14% of our helpline calls are where the individual references sports as the primary. We went from 2 to 5% up to 12 to 14%. We're noticing an increase. And that's where it's important. And that's why I'm so thankful that you can be a part of this webinar today, because sports gambling is something that will return. We will have sports gambling again. These numbers will take a temporary dip. And this is just for a short season. But the numbers will come back, because sports gambling is something that we've seen leading up to where we are right now was starting high demand. 88% of all sports wagers are also done online. And that's important. When you're using a mobile device, when you're using technology, that's a huge way to continue furthering the impact of sports gambling. There's three considerations we have to take a look at when we look at sports betting. And this kind of wraps into emerging trends also. First, the device or platform delivery is important. In-play betting, which we'll talk about, and also a cash-out feature. Before I get into that, I just want to check the chat real quick here. I think we might have a chat. Thank you, Rodrigo, for sharing that. And these were shared to all. And yes, John, you're right. Bowling leagues in connection with fantasy, something else that we're starting to see an increase in. So well said. I'm glad you're sharing that with the others. Very good feedback. Glad to see people interacting on the chat. Excellent. So let's take a look at the sports betting here. Number one, device or platform. I mentioned New Jersey has legalized online sports betting. Not every state has that. 2013, I mentioned earlier, New Jersey legalized internet and mobile device gambling. In 2018, when sports gambling was made legal, it was a natural symmetry, a natural synergy. Synergy. That's a hard word to say today. A natural synergy for those two to kind of get married, and they organically fuel growth. So over 85 to 88% of all sports bets are done online. I mentioned 88 before, between 85 and 88. It makes it easy to access, easy to use. It allows for real-time streaming information. It allows data to just get streamed on your personal friend, your phone, on a regular basis. It's convenient, it's portable, yet it remains subtle. It remains hidden. And therefore, it's non-stigmatizing. I could be sitting at a Starbucks, I could be sitting at a Buffalo Wild Wings, and I could be on my phone like a majority of other people who might be on their phone. But what I might be doing might be different from what the next person's doing. Might be the same, but you can't tell. So I don't have the fear of judgment when I'm placing a bet on my electronic device, as opposed to standing across from a teller who's accepting my bet, and perhaps I'm betting a lot of money. I fear perhaps that person might be judging me. I might catch a glance. I might see an eye contact that doesn't make me feel very good inside. But when you have mobile device gambling, I don't have to have that fear or concern. Let's take a look at point number two, live betting. Gambling in the old days on sports traditionally was pick a team, put money on that team, and at the end of the game, you either won or lost. That has transitioned and changed into something called live betting. Live betting, even going back maybe 10 years, was kind of called prop betting or in-play betting, where you could bet the score in the first quarter, you could bet halftime scores, you can bet on the Super Bowl, the coin toss. This past year, you could bet the color of the Gatorade that would be dumped on the winning coach's head. Those are all elements of in-play betting. However, live betting looks a little bit different than that. In-play sports betting is potentially more harmful, because what it does is it allows you to theoretically bet pitch by pitch in a baseball game. You could be sitting at a baseball game or sitting watching a baseball game, and you might think the next pitch will be a ball. You can maybe bet $1, whatever the limits are. And then the next pitch might be a strike, might be a home run. There's odds that are generated real time. The distribution of data and statistics is so lightning quick. It's almost as if it's akin to the world of day trading in the stock market, when transmission of stock prices and information has to be lightning fast. Same thing in the world of now in-play sports betting. It's a large number of bets that are possible throughout the game instead of just one bet on the outcome. And one of the biggest areas that you see this playing into is fear of missing out. When you start looking at fear of missing out, it's a big component of in-play sports betting. I don't want to miss out on that next pitch. I don't want to miss out on that next play, because someone who's watching a sports contest might tend to think their odds of winning money is a little bit higher, especially if they perceive that illusion of control, that they have more knowledge than the next person who's maybe not watching the sporting contest. And so they might think that they can win more money by watching the game because they're getting the flow of the game. They're understanding pitch by pitch. They're understanding what people are doing in the game, where someone might be ready to hit a home run or catch a long pass or throw a touchdown, whatever the contest is. I know in Europe with soccer matches, football matches in Europe, but soccer in the United States, they will wager on the next 90 seconds. In the next 90 seconds, will there be a goal? Will there be a corner kick? Will the ball go out of bounds? Will there be a penalty? And you can place there, all of these options generate odds. And it's fascinating when you see the preoccupation that takes place, especially if you have a mobile device, that you can literally watch a game through your phone without even seeing one thing that's happening on the field. You're just watching odds on a constant basis. Take a look at this screen here with open bet slips, because here's something with in-play wagering that we have to transition into point number 3, which is the early cash out feature. So if you have the ability to bet on something in the middle of the game, the sports books also said you should have the ability to cash out early before the game is done. Take a look at the one on the right. The one on the right is a bet slip. And this individual wagered on September 16th of 2019. They wagered $5 to win $8.75. And it was a European Soccer League game, right? EPL, English Premier League rather. Aston Villa against West Ham. Now, this contest probably started at 3 o'clock because it's now 3:37 in the afternoon. So they're 37 minutes into this contest. I would venture to say the score is probably 0-0 because the person wagered $5, but they're given an opportunity to cash out their bet right now for slightly less than that, about a 10% discount. They could choose to close out their bet and get $4.48 right now. So if you think of the game show Deal or No Deal, this is the right time to do it when you're looking at cash out functionality of a sports bet. They're being given an offer from the banker. The banker is saying, I'll give you $4.48 if you want to close out your bet now, or if you choose to not cash out, you can continue to keep this bet open. You might win, you might lose. But if the game keeps going and it looks like you're not going to win, that offer of $4.48, guess what? It's coming down. It's going to go down to maybe $3. It's going to get to a point where they're not going to give you an offer anymore because the sportsbook now knows the likelihood that you will not win. They're not going to give you an offer anymore. So this is an interesting element of sports betting, is that you almost get to play the game deal or no deal. And you can choose to cash out early, or you can choose to let your bet ride. Take a look at the slip on the left. This is an interesting one. Little bit, not your traditional bet. This is what's considered a futures wager. So back in 2019, this bet was placed June 7th. You can see that on the ticket. June 7th of 2019. This individual wagered $50 for the chance to win $10,000. So his odds were 200 to 1. And what he was betting was that the Heisman Trophy, which nominates college football's best football player, would be Joe Burrow from LSU, the quarterback from LSU. And so he bet $50 before the football season even started. That's why it's called a future wager. The outcome is going to happen at some point in the future. And so now, 6 months later, if you look at that slip, it's December 7th, 2019. And I believe that may have been the night that they were going to declare the Heisman Trophy winner. So Joe Burrow was one of the finalists, maybe 5, 6, 7 finalists, however many there are. This website was giving him an option to cash out his $50 bet. They would pay him $3,865.38 right now. And so he could hit that button, and he just turned 50 into 3,800. If he chooses not to, he could choose to either stay in and maybe win his $10,000, or if Joe Burrow was not given the Heisman Trophy, he would win nothing. So it's interesting how people would think about this. And I'm not going to ask for feedback, but just think about how you would handle this. Would you let it ride knowing that you only wagered $50 to try to win $10,000? Or would you cash out now and take that $3,800 guaranteed today? Interesting concept. These are the decisions and options that are now available to sports bettors. So it lets you take out your money early. It actually likens sports gambling to stock market trading. It's a way to lock in profits, to limit losses. It almost changes one's thinking from gambling to investing. And it further makes one think of gambling as instead of being skill-based gambling, now it's a form of skillful money management. So it's kind of shifting the narrative on sports wagering and how you handle your financial component and how you manage your money. It's an interesting dynamic. So if you're working with clients who gamble on sports, you're going to want to be asking questions about, hey, when you bet on sports, are you familiar with or have you ever taken advantage of betting in the middle of the game? Something called in-play wagering. Have you ever cashed a bet out early? You'll want to understand this because it's going to speak to the preoccupation and the level of involvement that this individual is partaking in that. So as we wrap up today, and forgive me, it's a little bit past, but that's fine. It's five minutes before. We'll still have time for a question or two. Sports gambling. It's about the illusion of control. It's that skill versus luck. Intermittent reinforcement. Every so often we win, and that's just gambling in general. Social proofing and marketing. If I see other people doing it, I'm at a higher likelihood to do it because I think there's no harm involved. Scarcity principle with some of those early cash out features. You better act now and act fast. Otherwise, that offer is going to be gone. And it's the near miss constantly. If you think about gambling problems, I want you to always think about that near miss. That is the hook. When someone is so close, they generally just want to do it again because they feel that the next time might be different. So the 5 E's, as we summarize, of why people game or gamble: excitement, entertainment, escape, economics, and that ego. It feels good. It's the pride, the reputation, or the identity. And the 5 A's to the perfect storm of gambling. We always have to consider the age, the availability, the acceptability, socially and culturally acceptable for most people. The advertising is a huge component, and access. Access to cash, to credit card, access to technology. But during these times especially, we have to learn and educate people, and we have to keep it fun. We have to make sure that people are setting limits, that they're gambling for fun and not for profit. They're setting limits of time and money, spending what they can afford, and perhaps right now, those numbers may even be coming down further because those resources are needed somewhere else, like food or shelter, medical supplies. Don't take money out and chase your bets. Take frequent breaks. We urge people not to consume drugs or excessive amounts of alcohol while they're gambling. I always like to think of the HALT principle and remind people that if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, don't gamble. Take care of those basic needs first and choose not to gamble. And also know those resources. 800 Gambler, we're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Our website is available. You can find us on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. We have a plethora of videos. We're going to continue to put out webinars. Our goal is to be putting them out once every week, every other week. So make sure you're staying connected with us just to gain some more knowledge and education during these times. So we have a few minutes. I would encourage you now, if you have a question, to reach on up into the chat. Feel free to type it. Let's see what we have here. I see Rodrigo. Yes, the sports betting was rampant and it was all illegal, and now it's legal. And that's one of the huge changes. That's also why we see more people calling. Generally, when an activity is legalized, people will feel more comfortable calling in and talking about a problem, even if we let people know that our helpline is confidential and everything we talk about will not be shared. It won't be shared. It's confidential. It's private. If you're participating in an illegal activity, you may not necessarily still want to divulge that information. So we're definitely seeing an uptick in that area. I'll give a moment here. Any questions that you might have? If not, my presentation in the PowerPoint will be available. Simply email me, dan.trollaro@800gambler.org. As I mentioned before, you can visit us on the web at 800gambler.org. Let me see, John, continue talking about the legitimacy of esports and the esports culture and its very pervasive connection to gambling. Yeah, John, I know you and I were chatting about that a bit in Delaware recently. You know, esports is one of those areas where we start getting the youth involved at an early age. And that's really concerning because kids learn from each other. So they're talking about it in schools. And actually, John, I know you do quite a bit of work in the schools. John, I'm going to give you, if you can, take 1 minute, kind of talk about what you're seeing in Delaware. Go ahead. John, let's see if I can get you there. Let me see if I can unmute you. Are you able to unmute yourself there, John?
Unmute.
Go ahead, John. I got you. You got a minute.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, Dan. First of all, excellent webinar. Great information. Yeah, so I go to schools throughout the state of Delaware, to middle schools and high schools, and talk to kids about video gaming addiction and its connection with gambling. And of course, we talk about esports, but like we also talk about a lot of the gambling components within the video games. The microtransactions, the loot boxes, and the wagering of skins, specifically on certain websites. But this information that you provided for us today continues to just build upon the information that we have and we need to continue to have as we go forward, specifically in this time right now where esports is really all anybody has, and electronic gambling is really all anybody has at this point. I was thinking about something a little morbid a second ago, that some of the junkie gamblers, and I can tell you from my own past experiences, are probably betting on the over-under of daily deaths from coronavirus. That's just the kind of stuff people gamble on. It's crazy. You know?
Thanks for sharing that. You're right, and I have heard the same thing. I've heard of a lot of different unique ways of gambling, both illegal and legal forms, and it's been really there's so much. And I'm just going to mute you back there because I know we have to wrap up. But thank you for adding that, John. And it's a tricky time. It's a unique time, but information like this is vital. We know the gambling world will come back. We know people will start gambling again. And, it's something that we have to stay on point with, something we have to be aware of, so that when it does come back, we're able to help people the best way possible. I want to thank everyone for being here today. It's 12 o'clock. We're going to wrap up the webinar. I wish you a happy Friday and a good weekend. And thanks again for your time. Have a good day, all. Bye-bye.